So we're going through the book of Jonah, and Pastor Unsu did a wonderful job of starting us off 2 weeks ago, back on June 9th, when he preached on the first chapter of Jonah. And many of us here have seen, whether it's a depiction or a picture, something like this, similar like this. The big story is where he gets swallowed by the whale. And that is actually chapter 2, which is today's chapter that we're going to be talking about. But before I go on, I wanted to ask this question about blessings that may come from the belly of the whale. Many people in life, when they go through struggles or when they go through hardships, their first question is why? Why am I going through this? Because many people don't like going through hardships. That's all of us. It's a universal trait. It's so universal that HarperCollins actually did a study. They researched, using Google, they researched what is the top number one. Actually, they did the top 10. What are the top 10 questions that people have of God? So they did an amalgamation of searches that said, why does God blank? Or why is God blank? And guess what the top search came in all the world? It is the question, why does God allow suffering? That's the number one Googled question about God. Why does God allow suffering? And many of you and I who have ever been through some extended period of suffering, whether it's a dark night of the soul, or whether it's losing a job, or whether it's losing a family member through health crisis, we've all been there, and we've asked the question, God, if you're so good, why would you allow this suffering to happen to me? Well, this is where we find ourselves in Jonah chapter 2 this morning. And to give you a context of what this chapter is about, I'm going to read to you the last line found in Jonah chapter 1, verse 17. And it reads this: Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now, once again, suffering and going through hardship is something that none of us in this room want to go through. And many times when we go through this, we ask the question, why? Okay? And so to answer that question today, I want to really cover this question. Pastor Unsu had a similar starting question, and so I have also a similar starting question today. Why does God allow suffering? And that's something I want us all to think about this morning. Is there some advantage to suffering? And through today's text, I want to show us all that there actually is. There could be blessings that come from the sufferings that God allows. Now, you know what was interesting in my trip to Korea? I actually met a couple of pastors that I know in Korea. And I asked them about their congregation members and what is the sort of cultural pulse of Korea. And do you know what they said? The number one question they have about God is not why do they allow suffering, but did you know that in Korea, the biggest question Koreans have is, why are they so lonely? I thought that was really interesting. Korea is going through a loneliness epidemic. Even though people have families, even though people have friends, people are more isolated and more lonelier than they've ever been. And to be honest with you, we in America, we're not that far away. But that's for another sermon that I want to prepare sometime in the future. But here again, I want us to ask this question, why does God allow suffering? And could there be any advantage to suffering that we can use so that we may be able to live life a little bit more joyously, freely and more with freedom. Sorry, that's what I wanted to really say. And so, number one, I wanted to point out to each and every one of us that, first of all, God allows suffering to spiritually mature us. To spiritually mature us. Where do I get this? Well, in Jonah, in Jonah chapter 2, the chapter that we're looking at today, what this chapter is basically it's a prayer by Jonah. It's a prayer that he prays in the midst of his suffering. In the middle of the belly of the fish, this prayer in chapter 2 is one of the greatest prayers you'll find in all the Bible. And look at what it says in verse 1 from chapter 2. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. It is in this dark night of the soul moment that Jonah has that he actually, for the first time in this entire book of Jonah, remember now, he's a prophet. He's supposed to be a man of God. But no place in chapter 1 do we see Jonah ever praying. Have you noticed that? He doesn't pray. This man, Jonah, is a man that God tells him to go to the Ninevites and preach God's word to this secular people. And Jonah, he's like this proud Jewish, prophet who says, well, they're a bunch of idol worshipers. They're not worth my time. I'm not going to go. So he runs away. And in the midst of his running away, as Pastor Unsu alluded to 2 weeks ago in his sermon, there was a storm, a huge storm that comes out in the midst of this escape that Jonah does. And if you read the text in the first chapter, the sailors, who are not God-fearing people, they don't even believe in God. They're the ones who are praying in chapter 1. And what is Jonah doing? He's asleep. He's asleep. And not only that, but when God actually calls him into going to the Ninevites, as a prophet, usually when God tells you something, I know as a pastor, I'm supposed to be praying about things. Like if God, if there's a decision that the church has to make and it falls on me, I'm telling you, one of the first things I'm doing is I'm getting on my knees and I'm praying to God for guidance. Because that's what we all need, right? As, when God brings us to something new, we have to pray for wisdom and guidance. Jonah doesn't even do that. He doesn't pray. He goes straight to escaping and leaving toward Tarshish, the opposite way of Nineveh. And then finally, when he gets thrown overboard, the sailors are all praying to God, saying, sorry, we really don't want to do this, but we have no choice. The sailors are praying, but Jonah, you never see him at one point in the first chapter at all praying at all. Why do I bring this point up? I bring this point up because sometimes God puts difficult seasons in our life so that we can quit running away from our problems and then we can actually face towards our issues and that we may be able to face them honestly and responsibly and realistically so that we may be able to see what is going on deep within us. Ladies and gentlemen, I have been a pastor for more than 20 years now, and in my experience, I have noticed that there is nothing like suffering that brings people to their knees in prayer. I know people who tell me at church, especially in like large mega churches that I've served at, they say things like, well, I'm praying and I do fasting and I do all these disciplines, but get a cancer scare or get a financial windfall, where a financial difficulty, And guess what they're doing? The first thing they're doing is they're on their knees and they're praying. This is what I mean about spiritual maturity. Jonah is a prophet who is supposed to be praying, but he doesn't throughout the whole first chapter. But gets swallowed by a fish and be thrown overboard. And guess what? In his dark night of the soul, in his difficulty, in his most difficult moment of life, from inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God. And so you see this posture of openness from Jonah. And I don't know about you, but many times when we experience pain and suffering, or when we're going through a calamity, many times the first thing we're going to do when we go through those times and moments is we go to the Lord in prayer. And that is why I believe, number one, the first benefit to suffering and pain is that God draws us closer to Him in spiritual maturity many times. Number two, before I even go to the second point, James, the author, which is the author of the Epistle of James, he's the brother of Jesus. He says in James chapter 1, verses 2, he says this: "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Do you see what the author of James is, even in the New Testament, this truth is being reiterated once again. That many times, sometimes it's a benefit to us to be in the midst of pain and suffering, like James is encouraging his readers. Consider it pure joy when you're going through these trials. Why? Because it matures us and it makes us persevere in our faith so that we may not lack anything. Now, the second benefit of pain and suffering, we see in Jonah chapter 2 in the 7th verse. It says here, it's during his prayer, Jonah prays this: "When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple." Here we see that Jonah, again, for the first time, realizes that he needs God. He needs God. He says point blank, when my life was ebbing away, like he was drowning in that sea. Imagine trying to gasp your last breath of life and your life is ebbing away. He says, "I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple." And once again, many times when we are facing these struggles in life, whether it be a health scare or whether it be a financial calamity or whether it be a family issue that we have, sometimes these problems arise where you and I don't have the power to resolve it with our own strength. When you get that diagnosis, when your father or your cousin or your family member calls you and says, "Hey, I just heard from the doctor, it's stage 2 cancer." I mean, you're at the other end of the line. What can you do? There's nothing in your power to help them. It's not like you can surgically remove that right then and there. And so there are moments in life like this where we are helpless. And our life is ebbing away. And we don't know what to do. In those moments, who do you call on for your help? And Jonah here calls on God. For the first time, he's dependent upon God. And he's like, I can't do this on my own. And he realizes that in the middle of the belly of that fish, in that most difficult point in his life, he realizes how much his life is dependent upon God's power. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're going through a difficult time in your life, but by the end of it, you can come out of it by saying, God, I'm going to put my trust in you, not in my own self. I see that as a win. I see that as a huge win. Because what's the other alternative? The other alternative is, you know what, God? I can't believe you're doing this to me now. And then your other alternative is to run the other way and say, I'm going to take care of this myself. I'm going to do everything by myself. Well, good luck. Because it's really difficult. It's really difficult to go through life on our own. But then it's even more difficult to do it without any help. And many times, God sometimes allows these things, these calamities, and these painstaking things in our life to see that we may be able to turn to Him to have a healthy dependence upon Him. And each of these points, by the way, I have undergirded them with a New Testament principle. And the New Testament principle comes from 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 through 10, Paul writes this: 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. See, for Paul, in the midst of his pain and suffering, he found an ability to go deeper within. And he reached deep down within and said, I am going to reach for Jesus. He is my strength. He is my armor. He is my rock, my redeemer. And if you are going through a time of crisis or pain at this moment, my encouragement to you is you got to look deeper within. You need a rock. You need a steady foundation that will keep you through this difficult time. And that is the second benefit of being in the belly and hardships, is that we tend to have a more healthier dependence upon God and not our own power. And finally, my third and last point, what is the benefit that we can get from suffering? Well, number 3, it's an increased compassion and empathy. Pastor Unsu alluded to this a little bit 2 weeks ago, but this is what I want to share in Jonah chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. Look at what Jonah says in the belly of the fish. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. I think one of the real poignant points, more powerful points about this prayer is in verses 8 and 9. I think for the first time we see in Jonah's life, you see him actually self-reflect. And I think through these sentences, he's actually admitting. He's self-reflecting and he's admitting his issues of his own heart. Tim Keller gave a wonderful sermon about Jonah that, of course, I'll never be able to replicate. But one of the insights that I gleaned from Tim Keller's take on Jonah is that he actually saw Jonah as a racist. There was a lot of racism in Jonah because of his posture. In the next few weeks, as I uncover the book of Jonah even more, going through chapters 3 and 4, I'm going to share with you one truth that I found really revealing through my study of the book of Jonah, even during my time in Korea. As I was studying this, did you know that some scholars actually debate that Jonah was actually not a young person? Actually, and this makes sense to me, some scholars say that Jonah, when he was called to this ministry, he was about 100 years old. So think about this for a moment. Now it all makes sense to me. He was like this grumpy old man. And that's why he had so many issues. And we're going to talk about this in the next 2 weeks, in the next 3 weeks, about grumpy old men and the fact that God can even use a grumpy old man. He can. So there's hope, guys. There's hope for the Karens and the Kens of this world. There's hope for the Karens and the Kens of this world. There is. You just got to get over yourself. And that's the thing. Jonah, I think, for the first time, gets over himself. In the belly of the fish where he is struggling, he's actually looking deeper within. And this man who was racist, who didn't want to preach the gospel to these, evil, idol-worshiping, terrible Gentile Ninevites. Look at what he says. To those who cling to worthless idols, turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. I think Jonah is realizing for the first time in his life of the idols that he had in his own life. And again, Pastor Unsu alluded to this 2 weeks ago when he talked about chapter 1. But I think the idols of Jonah was pride, ego. Also another idol for him was nationalism, Israel nationalism. He thought his race was the best. And I think he is now coming face to face with the idols that he has in his life. And he's like, my gosh, I have these idols. Those who cling to worthless idols, they turn away from God's love to them. He knows that he was trying to escape. But now that he's in the belly of the fish, he's realizing, my God, I made such a terrible mistake. And so, with shouts of grateful praise, I will sacrifice to you. And what is the sacrifice he's willing to make? He's gonna make good the promises he made. And I think it is at this point in his life where he turns around and says, fine, I'll go. And I will say to all the people who will listen to me, to all those disgusting, nasty Ninevites who I don't like, I'm going to say salvation comes from the Lord. I don't know about you, but for me, I have found myself increasing in my capacity to be empathetic when I go through trials my own life. See, when I was young, and when I was a young minister or pastor, when people would come to me with like prayer requests like, well, my father has cancer, or my grandmother is dying, or, things like that, my empathy level wasn't that great. It was just more like, okay, I'll pray for you. And we would do the rituals and I would pray. But it wasn't until my own family member had died from cancer that I realized, oh my gosh, now that I have gone through this myself, there's so much empathy now. My empathy has grown as a result of experiencing these dark nights of the soul, experiencing myself, what it feels like. You know, when I was working on Wall Street, I know I try not to bring this back up, but when I was younger and I was making a lot more money, you know, in the secular world than I was in the ministerial world, when I was making a lot of money, I didn't have compassion for the poor. I didn't. You know what I said? I mean, while I was working on 55 Wall Street, on my office on the 45th floor, my thoughts were, well, why don't these lazy bums just get off of welfare and just do something for their own life? Just get an education, go to a good college. That's what someone would say from a high ivory tower like me, making, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. But then it wasn't until I was in ministry and we were living in LA and the prices to live versus, the money that we were getting was so tight that we had to apply for financial aid. We had to apply for food stamps to feed my family. And ever since then, I have looked at people who receive care and medical aid and financial aid from the government completely differently. Because I was there. I felt it. I understood what it's like to be so poor and to feel helpless and to feel like a failure to your family, that you can't provide food on the table. Do you know how hard that feels? It's not just some easy answer to say, well, just go get a job, you lazy bum. That's what all the people who have made it, that's what they say. But if you've ever been there, then you'll know what it feels like to go on an empty stomach and give food to your kids while you go hungry because you want to feed your kids more than you want to feed yourself. And that's how many millions of Americans are living today. And it is this empathy that must grow within us. God has to sometimes God purposely places us in these moments of pain and suffering to increase our empathy for others. Paul says this perfectly in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. He says, praise be to the God of our Father, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all of our troubles so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves received from God. See that? Sometimes God allows these things in our life so that we may turn around and help others. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we have an increased empathy for those others who don't live like us, who don't look like us, who don't make as much money as we do, whatever it is. God will sometimes allow these pains in our lives so that we may be able to help and bless others. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.